Right now, we're in the year 2019. Have you ever wondered what it would be like if Jesus died and resurrected today instead of about 2,000 years ago? Well, popular atheist and activist Matt Dillahunty thinks that God would have made a boneheadedly stupid decision to send Jesus 2,000 years ago instead of now, a time when the event could have been validated and tested to a much higher degree. Fair point or nah? Let's talk about it. So I'll start off with something that you probably don't know and may not expect. Now, personally, I have a love-hate relationship with Dillahunty's channel. Out of all of the YouTube atheists that I follow, I find myself agreeing with him more than any other when it comes to issues related to epistemology. That is, until he takes it to the point of being completely unreasonable. But I'll be talking about that in another video coming out pretty soon. And today's video isn't about where we agree, but instead where we disagree. So let's get on with it. Y'all boys ready? Then let's go!
The best time would be today. To have Jesus come forward today and say, I'm going to be killed, and 3 days afterwards, I will be resurrected. And then toss his ass in the electric chair, shock him till he's dead, get doctors to actually verify that he's dead with all of this being recorded. Then 3 days later, boom, he's alive. That would be amazing. That would be leaps and bounds ahead of what we have from a 2,000-year-old document by anonymous authors who were not eyewitnesses, who may not even have been, may have gotten their information second or third hand from eyewitnesses.
So as you just heard, in his debate with my friend Mike Winger, Dillahunty thinks that it would have been far better for God to have Jesus come, die, and resurrect today rather than about 2,000 years ago. He seems to think that us having modern doctors and video cameras would make today a much better time for Jesus to come, die, and resurrect. He goes on to say a whole lot more that we could talk about, but rather than having this video be already way longer than it is now, let's just focus on that quick clip for this video. So it seems pretty straightforward. For Dillahunty to claim that Jesus resurrecting today would constitute as better evidence than what we currently have, we only need to compare two things. First, the confirmation of his death would be better today than it was 2,000 years ago. And two, the confirmation of Jesus being alive again 3 days after his death would be better today than 2,000 years ago. In support of this, he appeals to the electric chair, us having our modern doctors, and having video footage. So if these 2 points can be shown to be superior to what we currently have, then it seems that his point would be a decent one. The only question now is it? Let's talk about him. So let's say his scenario really did happen and Jesus came today and died by the electric chair, and then people saw him alive again 3 days later. What would that look like? Well, to start, with the exception of a few states, we use lethal injection instead of the electric chair. But for the sake of the analogy, we can consider both and compare them to crucifixion. In ancient Rome, victims of crucifixion would have been scourged to death by having their skin ripped off in big chunks, exposing their internal veins and organs, while having their ankles and wrists nailed to a cross to die a slow and agonizing death. If death took too long, the Roman guards would break the knees of the victims to accelerate the process of suffocating, since pushing up on the legs would help them to breathe. And to ensure that the person was dead, they would finish them off by stabbing them in their side with a spear. So if Jesus were to come back to life after being executed, to me it would seem to be far less miraculous if he did so after dying by the electric chair or lethal injection. I could easily imagine that being explained away as some sort of natural unknown phenomenon or irregularity. If he came back to life after being crucified, now that would be something miracle-worthy, or something that you couldn't simply write off as a fluke. Not to mention, if Jesus did come back to life after dying from the electric chair or lethal injection, he would look relatively the same as he did at the time of his death. This would make it even harder for people to believe that he was supernaturally raised from the dead in a resurrected and glorified body. On the other hand, if it was some sort of unexplained fluke that brought Jesus back to life after 3 days after being crucified, the first eyewitnesses would never look at the body of the scourged Jesus and say, "It's a miracle, he resurrected!" You're right. Gee, I sure can't wait to have a resurrected body like that one day. So it seems to me that Jesus being executed during that period of Roman crucifixion would be far superior, at least to when it comes to these points. All right, let's keep going. So say that our government executed Jesus today, and we had doctors viewing his body to confirm that he was really dead. Now, here I want to make his argument slightly stronger by adding the criteria that the same doctors would also confirm that he was alive 3 days later. Would this then be something that Dillahunty would accept as evidence for the supernatural? I very much don't believe so, and we'll come to see why here in a bit. But real quick, there's a few things that we can say about this point though. If the criterion were simply to have doctors confirm that someone died and then confirm that they were alive again, I think here it's worth noting that there are plenty of people who doctors have pronounced dead that have come back to life later. And several of these people have reported seeing all kinds of things that you couldn't see if you were dead and your brain stopped, if we had no souls, as many atheists believe. But that's another video altogether. The major difference here would be the time difference. As far as I know, we don't have any reports of people coming back to life after being dead for 3 days. But if this did happen, what would be concluded? Would these same skeptics conclude that a resurrection really happened and was supernatural in nature? Tell me what you think down below. Dillahunty goes on to argue that the documents were written by people who weren't eyewitnesses. Now, given the time that they were written, this isn't exactly shocking or alarming, although I'm sure it sounds like it could be to those who aren't deeply familiar with the culture and ancient history. But a modern parallel of this story today would be a reporter going to interview one of the doctors who was an eyewitness, and then the same reporter goes and interviews another doctor who witnessed the event, who also confirmed what happened. And then the reporter goes and does the same thing with another, and then another, before eventually putting everything together in a report for others to read. Now, let's say that this reporter isn't the only one to do it, but other reporters do the same thing. In the end, what we have are reports from reporters who wrote down and reported the event to us. At this point, all of the sources that we received information from are all second-handed, and if another reporter cited their reports, then it would be third-handed reports. Also note that since we're looking for modern parallels, the time gap wouldn't be an issue as it would be today, given that we're in a written culture and they were in an oral culture. So in some ways, speaking would be the equivalent to writing today, since that's how information was passed on in that culture, and they would train people to do so since they were little kids. So the time gap wouldn't pose as an issue for the sake of this analogy. In any case, all of the sources would be from people who virtually none of us know personally, and future generations certainly wouldn't know personally. Would we then consider that these reports are unreliable documents? What if they were lying? Couldn't we just say that the reporters were lying? Well, that depends. In my mind, I would say that the probability of them lying or inventing a story would be higher if we could spot some obvious motives to do so, and the probability of them lying would be lower if they knew that lying could create greater troubles than any potential payout. Given this, we would actually have more of a reason to doubt reports today than we would back then. Just think of news today. Today, we know that reporters flat out lie and exaggerate things for ratings, which leads to more financial and social gains for the reporter, which ultimately will help them boost their career. Unfortunately, today, in most cases, it doesn't seem that reporting false information can ruin your career or cause you social or economic disaster, because people today care less and less about facts than ever before. This is most evident in today's political arena, because there's so much information out there and people have no idea how to sort through it to find the facts. They'll often just accept information that personally makes them feel better. We have reporters on both sides of the political debate accusing the other side of fake news, and this has made a lot of people distrust news outlets more than ever before. So thinking that we would have reports on something as controversial as God coming to earth to help us because we're all sinners is almost inconceivable. In general, most people feel like they can't trust reporters to give us accurate and fair information anyway. People would assume that the reporters would likely spin the story to their side's narrative. And as far as I can tell, reporters today have an obvious motivation to lie or exaggerate. The difference with the first disciples is that historians are virtually unanimously in agreement that they were sincere and genuinely believed that they had seen Jesus alive again after he was crucified to death. One reason for this is that the first disciples and those who recorded the testimony of the disciples had nothing to gain in terms of money, power, sex, or anything else that would be comparable to what a reporter would gain today. The early Christians were a small and persecuted sect who were seen as a threat to the governing officials and the religious majorities of the day. They wouldn't be looking forward to getting money, power, or sex by inventing their stories. The only thing that they could look forward to for spreading the message would be persecution and possible death. There isn't anything obvious for them to gain by lying, and there would be a whole lot for them to lose, including possibly their lives. We have plenty of examples of what it looks like when people do invent stories, such as we see in the Gnostic Gospels. And in the Gnostic Gospels, we see widely exaggerated claims that we don't find to be paralleled with the Gospels. We also see a lot of embarrassing details included in the Gospel accounts that you wouldn't expect to see if the authors were just making it up. Things like the disciples messing everything up all the time, frequently not knowing what Jesus was talking about, falling asleep when Jesus asked them to stay up and keep watch, Peter denying Jesus 3 times, Jesus crying in the garden before crucifixion because he was too scared to go, Jesus calling Peter Satan, the disciples hiding like cowards after Jesus was crucified and even denied knowing him, and the list goes on and on. Now, does that sound like a good way to try to convince people of something that you just made up? It seems pretty unlikely that they would be including all of the embarrassing facts that they did if they were just inventing the story. And couple that with the fact that they had nothing to gain and quite literally everything on this earth and even their lives to lose. Even if you don't believe that they were right about what they claimed to see, it's far more reasonable to conclude that they were reporting honestly, even if mistaken about what they saw. Now, there's plenty of other reasons that go along with these, but these are just a few of the reasons why historical scholars, no matter what their religious beliefs are, agree that the disciples were genuine and sincere in believing that they really did see Jesus raised from the dead. Now, what about video recording? We could just sidestep this whole secondhand source thing if we just had the doctors and Jesus on film before and after his death, rather than just hearing it from reporters on the nightly news station. Wouldn't that convince people? Well, let's say Jesus did come now and was recorded on film for everyone to see. Would this change the mind of atheists like Dillahunty? Would they then bow down and worship Jesus as Lord? Dillahunty said that even if he was convinced of God, he still wouldn't worship him. But if the evidence of Jesus being resurrected was on video and it still wouldn't spur him and those like him into worshiping or accepting God, then what would be the point of God doing it today instead of back then? If the point isn't to convince people into entering into a loving relationship with God, then I don't see what would be accomplished by God doing so. After all, God isn't interested in just getting people to believe that he exists, but he wants to save them by bringing them into a saving knowledge of himself. But even putting that aside, if Dillahunty's scenario were to happen the way that he envisioned, do you really think that Dillahunty would then finally be convinced that Jesus is God or that God exists? Well, I can't answer with certainty for Dillahunty, but I can answer for myself. Honestly, I personally wouldn't believe it just because I saw it on video, especially today. I would actually be inclined not to believe it. If you think about it, today is the hardest it's ever been in history to trust what you see on video. Not only do we have movies and videos that make fake events look real, but we also know that it's relatively easy to manipulate videos into making it appear that someone else is talking who really isn't talking in actuality. People call this technology deepfakes. Take a look.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time.
Jordan Peele created this fake video of President Obama to demonstrate how easy it is to put words in someone else's mouth.
Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet.
Despite bans on major websites, they remain easy to make and find. They're named for the deep learning artificial intelligence algorithms that make them possible. Input real audio or video of a specific person, the more the better, and the software tries to recognize patterns in speech and movement. Introduce a new element like someone else's face or voice, and a deepfake is born.
So again, even if we had the event on video and we had the doctors giving their testimony on video and everything like that, would this then be enough to convince them? And by him, I mean Dillahunty. The same guy who said in his debate with Mike Licona, he was asked if he would be convinced of the supernatural if he saw someone's head get cut off inside of a room and then the person walked out of the room moments later and say that they met God and were miraculously healed. He answered by saying that he still wouldn't be convinced of the supernatural. So apparently it's not enough for some eyewitness's testimony to change his mind, and after hearing that, I'm not convinced that even his own eyewitness testimony would change his mind. I could say so much more about this, but I plan on doing so in a future video. But given that I'm right about his views here, that leaves us with the question of why he would bring up this argument in the first place. Think about it. If Jesus coming today and 2,000 years ago is functionally the same for Dillahunty and it essentially wouldn't cause him to believe in God or believe that Christ is Lord, then it ultimately wouldn't make much of a difference for him. And if it doesn't, then there really is no point in bringing it up because it wouldn't change his mind or the mind of those who think like him anyway. Now on to my final point. The last point I want to make about this is that if Christ didn't come and resurrect when he did, then a few things wouldn't have happened. Dillahunty argues that even if God did exist, it would be far better for Jesus to come now instead of when he did. But I would argue the opposite. Here's a couple of more reasons why I think that it was better for him to come 2,000 years ago than it would be if he came today. First, and as we just saw, as far as I can see, there isn't any greater credibility that would be gained if he came today rather than if he came when he did. In fact, if things went the way that Dillahunty said in his scenario, then we would have even more reasons to doubt the validity of the event today than the Jews would have at the time of Jesus. And secondly, if Jesus came today rather than when he did, then the truth of Christianity wouldn't have spread globally like it has today. The timing was just right for the news of Jesus to spread throughout all of the world. This is one of the reasons why every other religion is, for the most part, right where it originated. If you reject that the truth or the message of Christianity had anything to do with it, then you could still grant that the timing worked out just right for the spread of Christianity, which wouldn't have been possible if Christ had come today. And finally, so many people just don't realize how much Christianity has shaped our modern world for the better. Christianity gave us the ethics, hospitals, educational system, human rights, personal freedoms, and so many other things that we value today. Christianity was directly responsible for the start of so many of these things, but that's what my upcoming documentary is all about. So you'll just have to wait for it to get released because I won't be able to do it justice here in this short video. So it seems like the conditions that we mentioned earlier, as far as I can tell, have been met. I just don't see how Jesus coming today with our modern doctors and video cameras would have made the evidence any more compelling or convincing to people. In fact, given what we discussed, I think that it would actually have made it harder for people to believe. It's up to you whether you agree or disagree with me. Just go ahead and leave your thoughts down below in the comments. To be fair, Dillahunty did mention other points in the video that we unfortunately don't have the time to get to today because this video is already long enough. Right now, we're just going off of the arguments that were made in that short clip. We can go through the other clips if enough people request it and want to hear my response to it, then I'll be more than happy to respond to them. And that's it for today, so subscribe because if you like this video, just wait till you see what else I got coming. And the next time you hear Dillahunty saying,
To have Jesus come forward today, that would be amazing. That would be leaps and bounds ahead of what we have.
could you kindly do me a favor and tell me what you're going to say?
What do you mean?